Yeah.
he sort of caught up, and sort of from that point forward, he also sort of started to assert dominance in the Beatles, From Sgt. Pepper onward, Lennon sort of took a step back. He was less interested in the whole Beatle thing from that point forward, and McCartney started to drive the Beatles in a way. You know.
What are your thoughts on Harrison during this period?
Yeah, Harrison, it's a very important album for him as well. He already had a couple of good tracks on Rubber Soul, but this was a completely different ballgame. Taxman is amazing.
It's his first opener, right? It's his first opening track.
Yes, for them to give Harrison, who just had recently started writing songs, in the early albums, he would just sing songs that Lennon and McCartney would write for him, just like Ringo.
Yeah.
And for him to have the album opener and to have it be this track, right? Taxman is not a throwaway track. It's not, it's in no way a track that they just, you can hear them having fun on this track. You can hear them digging into it. They were as excited to work on Taxman as they were excited to work on the Lennon-McCartney stuff.
Yeah.
This was this was the point in which he had reached, I think, parity with Lennon-McCartney in the quality of his work, if not the quantity.
Right.
The Indian stuff, I like less.
Yeah, we were talking about this before we started recording.
Yeah,
this particular Harrison song, "Love You Too," is neither of our favorites.
Yeah, on the album, that's true. It feels a bit out of context for me, but it is still a pretty good track, all things considered.
Yeah, and it's a first of its kind, I think, in the sense of it being an Indian mashup with Western melody.
Yes, exactly.
This is his first Indian track, right?
Yeah, and I actually like it more than the Indian track on Sgt. Pepper. It's a nice track, and it flows, within the context of the album, it flows quite well, in my opinion. But generally speaking, the entirety of this album, I think, if I had to pick a favorite, I would never really pick a favorite Beatles album because I like all, from Rubber Soul onwards, I'd say that each one of them is my favorite in a different way.
Yeah, it's hard to go wrong once you're starting from Rubber Soul.
Yes, and in some ways the White Album is my favorite. In some ways, Abbey Road is my favorite. It's definitely the best sounding and the most modern sounding out of all of their albums. In terms of production and sound.
I'll always say that Abbey Road is their masterpiece, even if I don't necessarily think it's my favorite.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes it is my favorite, to be honest, but I think of it as the masterpiece album more than Sgt. Pepper's, in the sense that it's just kind of like a culmination of everything they ever did.
Yeah, that's true. If you're trying to get someone, if you're trying to
wrapped it up so well. It's like wrapping up the career with one record. In that sense, I think Abbey Road is just like that. You know what I mean? It's just like, this is the Beatles. Here you go. Like you were saying. Yeah.
That's what. Yeah. What I was going to say was if you meet someone who has never heard the Beatles now, but is a musician, I don't know how that could be possible.
It's not possible.
But let's imagine that happens.
In a world.
Then Abbey Road would be the album that you would give him to get him hooked on them.
Yeah,
right?
For sure.
Even though it's the last album.
Right.
It's modern sounding enough to not be jarring for someone who's used to modern sounding records.
Right.
And it is a masterpiece from start to finish. But I think that for me, the thing that, when I was a kid, the album that changed my perspective of music in general when I heard it first, I'd say that Revolver would be the one. Yeah. You can feel them working at the peak of their creative powers, and they're not tired of anything yet.
Right.
They were tired of touring by then, but you cannot hear that on the record. On the record, they're just finding the excitement of really working in the studio.
Yeah.
of really putting in hours to create studio songs in the studio as works of art and not just capturing
Yeah.
the song that they had rehearsed previously as it's being played live.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, this was the beginning of what we think of studios now. This was the beginning, you know, this was Genesis, you know, Rubber Soul and this album is like the genesis of the project studio, of coming in and creating a song.
Yeah. It's pretty amazing when you think about it like that, between that and also the sampling, which is like you can't escape sampling, you know, in the modern studio. It's just like, you're totally right. It's the beginning of what we know today.
No doubt. No doubt. This is the record that had basically defined our profession.
Yeah.
Your phone fell.
My phone fell, but everything is cool as long as we're still recording.
This was the album that defined our, you know, profession as producers and sound engineers in the modern era, basically. You know, This was the first album, well, the second album, really, if you count count Rubber Soul. But this was really the first one in which the studio was used as an instrument. Right. The studio itself became part of the soundscape.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that on a songwriting level, I would say that maybe Rubber Soul was the first record like that. But I think in terms of like the studio itself, I would say Revolver much more. And I think Jeff Emmerich coming in as the main engineer had a lot to do with that. Yes. And I would say also just before I forget, you have to check out Jeff Emmerich's book, Here, There, and Everywhere, named after one of the songs on this album. Is just if you haven't read it yet, it's a must read. I will put a link.
Yes, also Mark Lonson's recording the Beatles, I think, is probably just as important to check out, if not more, because it's not an opinion book. You know, Jeff Emmerich book is...
It's very personal,
It's in a way, it's
very
subjective,
personal.
Yeah. However, Mark's book is basically, it documents the entirety of the Beatles sessions from the first one that they did up to the very last one that they did. Every session meticulously documented who played what, who recorded what, when the overdubs were done, what equipment was used. That is a lovely, lovely book to read, even though it's just huge. It's an enormous book. It also has like pictures of all the equipment and detailed explanations of all the equipment, which is basically the first half of the book. You know, which I skimmed through, but I'm not going to claim that I've read that part because I'm not that much of a vintage gear geek. Maybe one day I'll read the entire
when the internet goes down forever. Get to it.
Yeah, but the second half of the book, which basically chronicles their entire recording sessions, is just fascinating if you're into the Beatles. So I think we can actually, switch to talking a bit about the technical side of
that'd be great.
Of recording Revolver specifically. Yeah. Aside from
the context, the background.
Yeah, aside from Tomorrow Never Knows, which we've already talked about, and interestingly enough, it was the first track recorded for the album. So actually, on Tomorrow Never Knows, Revolver is well known, like in engineer circles, as the ADT album. This was the album Ken Townsend, I think is his name, right?
I'm not sure.
He was one of the engineers at Abbey Road. He created what we now call a doubler.
Right.
Specifically for the Beatles sessions, because John Lennon asked them to invent something that would rid him of the tedious task of double tracking his vocals all the time. And
so spoiled.
Yes. And basically what they came up with was a tape machine which ran on an oscillated speed variator. So they would run the vocals the vocal track he recorded parallel to the original vocal track through that tape machine, and that would basically oscillate the speed around the original track, right? It would introduce minute variations in speed,
Yeah.
which would basically,
Time and pitch would shift a little bit.
Time and pitch would shift just slightly, and they would create this kind of flange doubler effect.
Right.
This is basically what a doubler does, right?
Right, between like 10 and 20 milliseconds or something, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it oscillates the signal around the existing signal. Sometimes it's a bit slower, sometimes it's slightly faster. So it never loses sync, but it is
right. And also
different enough to create the illusion that it's a doubled vocal.
Right, because it varies. It doesn't cut. You don't hear it as an effect constantly. You hear it as like it actually sounds like two voices.
Yes, and also Waves actually have a great plugin that emulates that. It's called Real ADT.
Yep, I use it.
Yeah, I use it also. It's basically exactly modeled on their machine that they came up with at Abbey Road at that time.
Just has a bit more character than your classic doubler. So
yeah, it's a bit more unpredictable also.
Mm-hmm.
But generally speaking, it was not used on Tomorrow Never Knows because it wasn't invented yet. It was invented during the sessions of the album. Yeah, and it wasn't available yet for Tomorrow Never Knows.
So it's used on
Tomorrow
like
Never Knows, on Tomorrow Never Knows, he double tracked it manually, and but it's on a bunch of other songs. I think it's on most of the tracks, of
Lennon
the album.
sings.
No, it's also on. I think it's also on Taxman, and I'm pretty sure it's on a few songs that McCartney sings as well.
Really?
Yes, I think it's on the backing vocals for Eleanor Rigby as well.
Nice. Well, Eleanor Rigby is so this isn't the first instance of using strings in a Beatles
that was
record.
Yesterday.
Right, another McCartney track. But there's something about the strings on Eleanor Rigby that really I find very I connect with it.
Yes, Eleanor Rigby is great. Eleanor Rigby, George Martin scored that, and he scored it specifically to resemble the spiky string sounds that were popular in Hitchcock movies. Right? Hitchcock had a composer, I forget his name, it's escaping me right now. I'm like in the back of my mind trying to figure it out, but I forgot his name. Never mind. You can put it on
the internet will figure it out for us.
Yeah, the internet will figure it out for us. Who wrote those kinds of very spiky string sounds for the scores of Hitchcock movies. And that was the sound that George Martin was going for. That is an ingenious score. I think it's probably the best score in string score in the Beatles entire catalog.
Wow.
I also very much like the score that Mike Lander, I don't exactly remember his last name, who scored the strings piece on Sgt. Pepper, which is She's Leaving Home.
Yeah. Also gorgeous.
Yeah, that's also a gorgeous piece. Yeah, and that was actually, he went to a freelance arranger because George Martin wasn't available, and George Martin was really offended by that. But eventually it worked out great because he wrote a wonderful score.
I feel like it must be pretty intimidating to get approached by a Beatle and asked to score one of their songs.
I don't know if people considered that way at the time. We think about it that way today because the Beatles are so mythological. But back then, without the benefit of hindsight, it probably was pretty intimidating still because they were the biggest stars in the world. But, I don't think that people who were classically trained and dealt with arrangement and music on a daily basis had in any way considered pop music to be an important art form back in those days.
Yeah.
They would probably think of, the Beatles back then, as like fluff. You know, they would